Mr. Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. And it's always a pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman, not only because he followed me into leadership and discovered just exactly how pointless that really was, but so in that we can immediately agree. And he may well have stumbled into another agreement point, which is, as now he is a Cummingsite, he should know that I once employed him and then let him go, so maybe it's time for him to do the same. So anyway, beyond that, I want to congratulate you, because there are things I did agree with him and obviously things that would need further discussion. But I want to first of all start by thanking my right honourable friend for his deliberations on this. This bill I will support tonight. It is long overdue. It has been long, long overdue. And the debates around the Huawei stuff at the beginning of the year really exposed the fact that the UK had actually kind of lost its way in this area in terms of threats, etc. We were behind the others, Australia, the United States, some of our big Five Eyes compatriots. But at least he's grasped the nettle and he's brought this bill forward, and I think it is to be laudable for him. And also I want to thank him for his courtesy, too, in the course of this, in the sense that he spoke to me and I know others. And I want to particularly commend the courtesy of his minister, my honourable and very good friend, who went out of his way to talk this through with colleagues on all sides of the House. So I want to start by that. So this discussion debate is in that sort of context, which is this is right. And they are right. And I particularly like the sections 32, 39 onwards, which deal with penalties, fines, incarcerations, and the scope of those up to 5 years. And I think these are strong recommendations, slightly stronger than I expected, to be quite frank with him. But I do think that they are well worth it. And there are many other good things about this, and I won't run through them all because he's done that, and I want to tease a few points out on this which I think are relevant and need inquiry. So it gives the Secretary of State great powers for industrial strategy powers to screen these investments that we've been discussing and to address national security risks that they involve. And it gives them also the power to call in investments. And we've been through those already. But I want to just pick up on the things that I think are missing here, which I hope in the course of its passage the Secretary of State will look at again. The first is we have to accept that parked across this space are two very big threats. Russia and, of course, China. In fact, I think China is now the single biggest threat and problem that is posed to the United Kingdom and the free world. And the way it is going, its problems, its difficulties, the way that it's focusing on internal suppression, external expansion, and trashing both WTO rules and laws, means that we will have to deal with this, and progressively more and more, I suspect, this bill will be right in the middle of this. So in dealing with that, I want to just raise a couple of issues. The fact is that without this definition of national security, I think the government is giving a stick to beat itself with at the moment. I think it's really important for two things. One, a couple of my honourable friends wanted clarity. I think it helps with the clarity. I've looked at some of those definitions out there, and I've looked at the American definition. And all right, it may not be perfect, but it does allow for some of the wider areas that I'm going to talk about in a second, under the transnational crimes, and it goes into things like threats through drug trafficking. But I think it is important for the government to think carefully about this because it will help define the bill. And that is because... Indeed.
Very briefly, just on what the Shadow Minister said, because there's obviously a genuine debate and a good one to be had over the elements of this bill. This is not necessarily about industrial policy, with great respect to the benches opposite, which is part and parcel of another debate, but it is about the modern definition of national security and how is it and whether you see it narrow or broad. And there's a strong argument today for a broader definition of national security.
Well, I do agree with him, and I agree with him that this is not the bill to discuss industrial strategy. There are wider points made by the right honourable gentleman, and I think they're worthy of discussion, but I'm not sure on this bill, so I want to keep this narrow. The first is that we understand in China something very, very special is taking place. This idea of civil-military fusion, which is now infecting every single enterprise and company in China. The Chinese military, as you've already heard, uses this concept, this strategy, to acquire intellectual property, technologies and research, for civilian use and for military use. An external investment screening body, therefore, really should be set up under this to establish and investigate cases where this may now affect UK investments. And this is really, really important because the rules are very strictly applied in China. You cooperate with the intelligence services or you're out of business, and you may also be out of not just your livelihood but your freedoms. And the indeed.
My friend for giving way. Is it even more dangerous that within the national security law in China, not only do you have to hand over data, but if asked by a foreign state, you have to deny that you're handing over data? If that is the case, should we not have a bigger debate about social media companies who are based in this country harvesting our data, our children's data, and where that data might end up down the line?
I, of course, completely agree with my honourable friend, and I was just going to come on to the data harvesting point, because this is caught in this. China's national intelligence law, she's absolutely right, requires all Chinese firms to assist with state intelligence work and to deny that if they are asked. Let's say the Secretary of State wants to investigate, and he says he has penalties in this, and strong penalties, for non-compliance. They are, by law in China, not allowed to comply with that process at all. So there is now already a national conflict in this. And ByteDance, she's right, because TikTok is owned by ByteDance. ByteDance are a very dodgy company, set up in China, and have huge links with the Chinese Communist government. So we need to be very careful about where we go with this, because maybe UK nationals get caught up getting punished for what is essentially a refusal by the Chinese government to allow others to do this. And I'm also slightly concerned about some of the things that would have happened in the past not being caught by this bill. Let's just look at this. I see that the Henry Jackson Society today has announced that, having looked through this, they believe something around 23, only 23, of the 117 Chinese acquisitions over the last decade would have actually been caught. And some of the areas that are out of this now, for example, let's take pharmaceuticals. The Chinese takeover of Bioproducts Laboratory, that has a very significant technology with regards to blood products. That would not have been caught. Education, 10,000, or rather 10 universities have many thousands of obligations to Chinese investors, where they get a trade-off on technology, wouldn't have been caught in this, and linked to defence firms. And finally, one of the other ones, which was rather interesting, I thought, was Thames Water and Veolia Water have significant share ownership from Chinese firms, but that certainly would not have been called into question in terms of the way it is. So I just... Indeed.
My honourable friend is referring a lot to China, and I'm sure he won't be alone in that this afternoon. I'm just interested, is his perspective that we should be looking in this bill to restrict all Chinese investment in the UK, or in particular sectors? And what is the differentiation if the origins of that are the Chinese state in this fusion of the state with business?
Well, my view about this is that this bill, this legislation, should actually help us identify exactly which of these are genuinely private and not located in China under Chinese law. That is going to be a big issue, and I have to tell him, in that question he is right, because we are now facing a very significant threat, I believe, from China. And so we now need to use this bill to figure out how we deal with that threat on a wider basis, not just on individual takeovers. And I think the government needs to look at that, and Huawei was a very good example of how that had to reverse government policy on that basis. But that is a growing problem, and I think he's right to raise it. And that's why I think that it's really important... Well, I am conscious others want to speak, but I will.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Would he agree with me that it is incredibly important that we recognise this national security and investment bill is not aimed at one particular country or any particular identified sovereign threat? It is a more general bill about the importance and value of national security assets in this country. Would you also agree that referring to China as communist, although of course it is ruled by the Communist Party, is actually a misnomer in terms of the context of what is a successful model of authoritarian state capitalism with which we will have to deal, and the world will have to deal. We'll have to separate those companies which offer attractive investment opportunities from those which are genuine threats.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. I know he's been a big champion of that relationship. We don't agree with each other on this matter, because I do think China poses, with its dictatorial government, a very significant threat. But I did speak about other countries. I did say Russia also poses a threat, so I recognise his defence. I just want to get on to the national interest test. I'm interested that this year the Australian government invoked the national interest in their looking at tests, and they used it in similar legislation to block the acquisition of a minor stake, and this, I think, might deal with the issue that the honourable gentleman was talking about, in mining from AVZ Minerals by a Chinese firm. And the asset they needed to intervene on was because, given what's happened with COVID, etc., that the asset had become deeply lowered in asset value, usually unnecessarily, which opened it up to a takeover, which would have been very unhelpful, they felt. And the other one I just want to raise in passing is that we do need to look at things like the Confucius Institute that are here investing in universities with offers, but actually are acting as behalf of the Chinese government to follow lots of Chinese students around. And so I want to also finish, really, and there are others to speak, I know, but I think the main point is that without that national security test, I think this bill will lack the clarity and definition and fail to understand sometimes where it's actually looking, and could be open to pressures to turn this more into an industrial policy statement rather than into a national security issue. So I think also, finally, the bill falls short on similar legislation's other Five Eyes partners. Now, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to say that they've looked across the scope of what others have done, but other Five Eyes partners have gone further in this, and they are competitor countries to us, so it's not as though that they have any kind of dictatorial regimes. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and the Australian Foreign Investment Review Board are external bodies, and this is the point I did want to say to him finally, is I just wonder whether he might want to reflect on the nature of the pressure on somebody like him, who is now, under this legislation, going to have to sum up and make these decisions finally on this advice peculiarly to him. Whereas these other two organisations, in Australia and in the United States, have this ability to say everybody is on the panel, makes a group decision on this one under the evidence. Now, I know he will argue it takes longer. Yes, he may be right about that. But I do feel the pressures on him, and I've sat 6 years in government, and I know what Downing Street does. It gives you a call, and it says, I don't think you have to go very far with this sort of stuff, do you? I mean, after all, this is worth a lot of money to us. Come on. I mean, you know, and others will say this, and he'll be sitting thinking, this is a balanced judgment, where do I go on this? And I just wonder whether that pressure isn't unfair, A, on the Secretary of State, and B, also leaves us wondering and be questioned later on why certain decisions were made. And I would, if I was Secretary of State, want to release myself from that point. I do not want to be dragged to the courts, to be accused of being biased in that decision and making a decision which wasn't agreeable. So I would look for a more external bodies to be able to judge this. And I do also say to the government generally, finally, that human rights is vital nowadays. We can't walk away from it. It is part of what makes us. And the reality for us is that far too many companies have allowed themselves quietly to get sucked into the use of slave labour and other labour in some of these areas. We know about that. We know about it in Xinjiang province. We know about it in other areas too. I simply say to my honourable friends, he does need to think about that very carefully. I don't want to make this a Christmas tree, but I do think there are elements of this. But otherwise, I say to my honourable friend, I congratulate the government on bringing forward this legislation. It is the right legislation to bring forward. It is overdue, no question, but I think the balance still needs to be widened somewhat, and I do hope in the course of the committee stages and the report stage, he will accept that there may be good amendments that come forward from brilliant people, not just myself, who may well be able to help him in his adventures. Thank you.